Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at The Amazing Spider-Man number 122 from 1973 in Marvel Comics, presented here in facsimile format. The most fateful Spider-Man saga in history continues, picking up mere moments after the shocking conclusion of the previous issue. Gwen Stacy is dead, cradled in Spider-Man's arms as the diabolical Green Goblin skulks across the skyline. The issue gives us an up-close and personal portrait of a man in deep shock, having seen the love of his life perish before his eyes, feeling no small complicity himself in the chain of events that led to her fateful plunge. The rage smeared across Peter Parker's features is without parallel in his career. Although it's axiomatic that Spider-Man doesn't kill, he sets out this issue for the purpose of killing the Goblin, ridding the world of Norman Osborn and the danger he represents. You almost believe he might just do it in the depths of his despair. Although the story stops just short of having Spider-Man be the direct author of the Goblin's demise, there's no doubt that his willingness to play for keeps heightens the tension and spurs the Goblin to panic, creating the circumstances beyond which he could be murdered by his own malfunctioning glider. Now, as a Spider-Man reader of long standing, I've always maintained that bringing Norman back in 1996 stands as one of the greatest mistakes Marvel has ever made. His death in this issue was both significant and fitting, and undoing it simply to provide a clean exit from a disliked storyline created far more problems than it was worth. Gwen's death stands as one of a bare handful in comics that will never and can never be walked back, various clone shenanigans notwithstanding. Bringing the Goblin back cheapened her passing, I will always believe, even as I acknowledge that griping about 27-year-old Spider-Man comics is a poor way to spend my remaining hours on this planet. A word then about the art for this period of the book, the best of both worlds, with Gil Kane's peerless composition supported by John Romita's sleek finishes. You know it's Kane because technically perfect athletic bodies are being drawn from unusual angles, and there's plenty of tight shots of Peter's philtrum as seen from below, as clear a sign of the master as any signature could be. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Hellblazer 84 from 1994 in DC Vertigo. Over the course of its initial 300 issues, Hellblazer managed to quietly accrue perhaps the most enviably consistent run of any book during the same period. It wasn't a series given to lackluster fill-ins either. One of the book's more charming tendencies was its habit of bringing back former writers for slight returns here and there. This issue is a perfect example, featuring the return of series original writer Jamie Delano, accompanied by Sean Phillips. This wasn't Phillips' first issue of Hellblazer either. He'd already drawn earlier fill-ins, both for Delano and fellow 2000 AD alum John Smith, but this was his first issue as the book's new regular artist, in which position he'd go on to illustrate not merely the next extended run of the book by new writer Paul Jenkins, but also a brief 4-issue interlude right after this issue, written by the great Eddie Campbell. This specific issue serves as an interstitial between the aforementioned Campbell's brief spell and the previous arc, the last by Garth Ennis and frequent collaborator Steve Dillon. That was the run that got me into the book, although I later went back and certainly read just about everything that followed. Delano's return here is used to explain one of the book's biggest mysteries. Just why was Chaz so devoted to John, since John did absolutely nothing but complicate Chaz's life at every turn? Well, as it turns out, John did Chaz a bit of a favor when they were much younger men. Chaz's mother was a witch, and not the good kind, but a right evil presence, especially as accompanied by her familiar, a nasty and rather violent monkey in a dress named Queenie. Hellblazer was never a book that shied away from the squalid and depressing, devoted as it was to presenting a more working-class view of magical haunts and habits. So too here, as Chaz's life is systematically ruined by a commandeering mother who just happened to have a little bit of genuine sinister power. Phillips is a great one for grime, which should come as no surprise to any fan of his more recent crime work, with longtime collaborator Ed Brubaker. Me, I don't always have the patience for crime stories shorn of any fantasy trappings, which are usually filled with people making suboptimal life choices. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marjorie Finnegan Temporal Criminal number 3 from AWA in 2021. When last we left our heroine, she was rocketing through time and falling to her doom, and the first few pages here detail her plummeting to the streets of future Manhattan. Of course, her buddy Tim, the disembodied time-traveling head, who sends her where she wants to go, catches up with Marge just in time to prevent her being turned into splatter on the sidewalk. But she still manages to fit in some creative cussing in front of school children. The problem is that her sister has somehow figured out how to track her through the time stream. Harriet shows up at the bar where she's knocking back sex TARDISes, while Tim recharges for another jump. From there, Marjorie starts jumping randomly to ancient Rome, the American Civil War, the Battle of Hastings, and the Jurassic era, all in the futile attempt to shake her sister. But there are other misdeeds afoot besides merely Marjorie's mischief. This issue offers insight into the master plan of the nefarious Lord of Evil and his associate and Marjorie's ex, Stan Zanzibar, the guy painted red from head to toe with with the little horns. Turns out that the aptly named Lord of Evil has plans with the Apocrypha, namely, to go back in time and make sure the Holy Bible gets printed with all the parts that were otherwise expurgated for public consumption. That's just the first step in the Lord of Evil's master plan for the conquest of time, although she doesn't get to hear the rest of it. The problem is that right after she accidentally uncovers this gruesome plot against history, Marge gets cold-cocked by her sister. After a fistfight, Marjorie's cuffed and arrested, and the next issue promises to show us life inside a prison for criminal time travelers. Garth Ennis's deeply cynical perspective on organized religion rears its head. Caveat emptor, the idea of secret shenanigans dating back to Bible times is a recurring motif in Ennis's work, dating all the way back to his career-making run on Hellblazer, and certainly Preacher. He's no fan of the Holy Scripture, I think it's fair to say. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marvel Comics Presents 25 from 1989. Since we've hit the halfway mark in our recitation of the Nth Man, this seemed a good time to double back for the character's actual first appearance, not in his own series, but as a backup feature here in Marvel's premiere anthology. Marvel Comics Presents launched in 1988 and lasted until 95, an achievement all the more impressive when you realize MCP was a bi-weekly book and racked up 175 issues for its first volume. Each issue featured 4 stories, and most issues carried some mixture of good, bad, and indifferent. It sold well on the newsstand, but suffered when that retail model broke down as the 90s wore on. One of the book's purposes, at least at the outset, was to preview forthcoming projects. Other notable late 80s launches like Quasar, Damage Control, and John Byrne's She-Hulk all premiered in these pages, just as Nth Man made his first appearance as well, just a couple short weeks prior to the release of his first issue. In terms of breaking down the premise of a rather unusual book, this preview actually gives us important information not proffered in the series itself. We're introduced to John and Alfie as kids at the Maryvale orphanage, and we also see the boys taking advantage of Alfie's strange powers to catch a glimpse into their futures. John is understandably upset that his friend has magical powers, able to show him a vision of his future self being taken captive by the Spetsboro and imprisoned at the Lubyanka prior to the events of issue 1, as well as establishing young John's crush on the future apparition of Colonel Novikova. We also see Alfie's future self in the process of destroying the nuclear armaments. From the very beginning, then, we are aware not just that Alfie is gifted with the visions of the future, but that these visions, perhaps sent by his future self according to issue 8, are almost certainly driving the boy mad. The rest of the issue is a grab bag in the true MCP tradition. There's a chapter of Don McGregor and Gene Colan's harrowing apartheid-era epic Panther's Quest, part of a Havoc solo turn by Howard Mackey and Rich Buckler, and the last story is an Ursa Major spotlight written by a very young Scott Lobdell. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Slain the Horn God number 6 from 1993 in Fleetway quality. We reach finally the end of our saga, the battle to end all battles, the final duel between Slain and the Lord Weird himself. Slain at the first appears at a disadvantage, tied down and ready to be split from groin to gullet, but the Lord Weird underestimates Slain at the last and is himself gored from Boar's tusk hanging around the king's belt, and then by the Guy Bulger, yes, the very barbed spear described so menacingly in earlier issues. Of course, the Lord Weird doesn't actually die from the spear. No, this is Slain the Horned God. Giant maggots from beyond our dimension come to Earth and eat him, and so he perishes. There is still, of course, much battle left as sinister Megrim marshals her worst sorceries against the armies of man. Ultimately, however, there is little she can do against the power of the warp spasm unleashed by the navel of Danu. This is Primetime Bisley, what you've been waiting to see, flesh stretched and torn beyond the realm of humanity, transformed by mystic rites into something more horrible than man. Slain's army falls as one into violent and human spasm, and so the battle is won. There is explicit discussion regarding the great push and pull of Slain's adventures, the conflict between historiography and politics on the one hand, and the desire on the other to see great endless bloody battle. Pat Mills is a clever sort and appears to understand quite well the torsion inherent in such a character. For indeed, this is a story about the weight of myth and the transformation of history, of the creation of the Irish nation and the traditions of ancient kingship, and it's also a story where beefy barbarians swing massive battle axe and sultry witches glower from atop flying dragons. Simon Bisley made his mark here, and although Slain has been illustrated by dozens of true worthies, some of the best artists 2000 AD has ever published, it is also true that Bisley's unmoored vision of the venerable king carries a definitive air. Gruesome and gorgeous in equal measure, Slain the Horned God is one of the great achievements in painted comics, one of the most memorable fantasy stories ever told in the medium, and a not inconsiderable work of mythography. It remains, even at almost 35 years remove, a masterpiece. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Batman Might Fall, a Legends of the Dark Knight special from DC Comics in 1995. The 90s was a crazy time. The present volume was created to answer a question that very few people were asking. Just where was Batmite during the events of Nightfall? You remember Nightfall. That was when Bane broke Batman's back and DC temporarily replaced the Caped Crusader with a dangerous psychotic. Well, over the course of that very long storyline, just about every Bat villain and supporting character got a moment to shine. And so too here with our buddy Batmite. If you don't know Batmite, he was created in 1959 to be Batman's very own answer to Mr. Mxyzptlk, an imp from another realm with vast powers, albeit usually far more benign than Superman's fifth-dimensional foe. Batmite was Batman's biggest fan, you see, which is why he always wears that homemade Batman costume. Now, as you can probably guess, there wasn't much need for a character like Batmite as the decades wore on, as Batman was slowly modernized, pulled up from the admittedly silly excesses of the 1950s and 60s, and in the direction of something darker and less campy. He still popped up for cameos here and there, such as in the pages of Batman Family in the 70s, but for the most part, Batman readers and creators both tended to see him as a symbol of the franchise's darkest period. Flash forward to the early 1990s, zenith of the post-crisis era. Characters from across the DC universe were systematically modernized, and in 1992, so was Batmite. What did the post-crisis Batmite look like? Well, he was a hallucination of a drug addict and career scale named Bob Overdog. Now, I know you're probably thinking that sounds terrible, a parody of Grim and Gritty's 90s reboot applied to the least likely character. However, as awful as it sounds, there was one good reason for 90s Batmite to exist, so Kevin O'Neill could draw him. O'Neill drew the first 90s appearance of the Mite in 1992's Legends of the Dark Knight 38, and that issue was apparently received well enough to rate a sequel. Mightfall, like the issue of Legends before it, was written by Alan Grant. Now, Grant was at the time also a writer for the mainline Bat books, and indeed was one of the writers who contributed to Nightfall. So, Grant is certainly familiar with the source material, but this doesn't read like a normal Batman comic. This reads instead like two veterans of 2000 AD given carte blanche to take the piss out of American superhero comics during a period of historical excess in the most savage manner possible. Turns out that Batmite has run afoul of his own nemesis, Bane Mite, who sets about to dismantle the not-so-dark Mite and conquer his entire dimension. The only one who can save them is our boy Bob, who just happens to have been force-fed 3 tabs of acid in a graveyard. It's in very poor taste throughout, no doubt, but with O'Neill at the helm, you'd be a little disappointed if it weren't. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the Nocterra Nemesis special from 2023 in Image Comics. I've been nibbling around Nocterra for a while. I read the first issue and found it a bit grim for my tastes, but nevertheless I liked the look of it due to the presence of Tony S. Daniel, so I picked up the first trade, a small enough investment. This new special does not, however, feature Daniel's art, even as he's credited with story alongside Scott Snyder. The reason I bought this special in the first place, considering I'm only half in on the story, is the guest art by Liam Sharp. I've long since past the point where I will buy anything with Sharp's name on it, rain or shine, and this one-shot certainly makes splendid use of his distinctive talent. In the first place, this issue is dealing squarely with the delivery of valuable exposition. The premise of Nocterra, if you've never read it, is that the world has been suddenly blanketed in sinister darkness, a living twilight inhabited by evil creatures who want nothing more than to destroy everything they find. The relentless darkness that forms the series' premise is actually explained here, and they couldn't have picked a better artist for the task. This is all about ancient, enormous beings of unimaginable evil dating back to the birth of the solar system and beyond, grand cosmic beasts who have been to Earth before and Mars, inciting extinction events in the ancient past of both worlds. The fearsome Nox is, we are told, the oldest life form in existence, and under Sharp's pen the creature looms terrifying and unimaginably large. In essence, an evil sky, blacker than night, and mottled with bright red eyes. It's a monster the likes of which Sharp was born to draw, and an origin issue that actually goes away towards inspiring me to catch up on the series. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the Incredible Hulk number 180 from 1975 in Marvel Comics, or rather, the recent facsimile edition, because I promise you, there is no way I could afford a real copy of this comic, one of the most important ever published, despite its humble veneer. Now, for much of its early run, the Hulk had a reputation as a repetitive read. Not a lot changed for the guy. He spent seemingly decades on end wandering aimlessly, always running into people who wanted to fight. Because he wasn't very bright, it was surpassingly easy for him to find find his way into brawls and other assorted hijinks, such as in this very issue. The Hulk lands in Canada, which means, of course, a fight with the Wendigo. The Wendigo is a silver-furred monster strong enough to go blow for blow with the Hulk, and also the victim of a weird curse that holds that any person who eats human flesh within Canadian borders turns into Wendigo. The Wendigo in this issue is Paul Cartier, and the plot is set into motion when his sister Marie attempts to trick the Hulk into taking the Wendigo curse from her brother, under the principle that Bruce Banner already has one terrible curse, so he probably wouldn't notice another. The plan goes relatively well at first. Marie lures the Hulk into a cave and gives him drugged food, which initially knocks him out. But the Hulk has too strong a constitution to stay out, and when he wakes up, he sees his former sparring partner, the Wendigo, scratching at the door ready to go another few rounds. So much for Marie's best-laid plans. Now, if you're still scratching your head about just why this issue is so important, the answer comes on the very last page, when we are introduced to the Canadian government's very own first line of defense against the Hulk. Yes, none other than Wolverine steps out of the shadows and introduces himself to the world for the very first time. See? I told you it was important. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Barnstormers #1 from Dark Horse Comics in 2023. I first encountered the work of Tula Lote in 2014 when I was completely bowled over by the latest Supreme reboot, Blue Rose. If you ask me to remember what that book was actually about, at this late date my recollection is a bit fuzzy, but I still remember what it looks like and what it felt like to read it. That visceral thrill was the experience of encountering Lote's work for the first time. It wasn't her first work. She'd been bubbling around for a little while, producing anthology pieces and covers, but that was the first time I remember seeing what she could do. It was clear as crystal from the very beginning that she was a special talent. Now, she doesn't do as many interiors as you'd hope. Sadly, a natural and predictable outcome of a world where in-demand cover artists have to take a sharp pay cut if they want to draw the inside of those same books. Once in a while, the gods smile on us, however, as with the topic of today's review, Barnstormers by Lote and Scott Snyder. Produced as part of Snyder's deal with Comixology, the series was originally published digitally on that venerable service, and here exists in pamphlet form thanks to the folks at Dark Horse Comics. Also worth noting that the series is a fresh Eisner winner, having won for Best Digital Comic at last week's ceremony. After I'd already set this review on the schedule, mind, a pleasant coincidence. As for the story itself, it's a yarn from the high water mark of the Roaring Twenties, featuring a dissolute, down-on-his-luck ex-balloon buster by name of Hawk Baron, or at least that's what he calls himself. What we know and he doesn't is that the days of stunt flying as a major attraction are just about gone by the time the story begins. The rise of actual commercial aviation and federal regulation brought an end to the days of Wildcat Barnstormers making money performing the small-town circuit, and that context makes Baron seem pitiful and even desperate. But things take a turn when he accidentally crashes a wedding, which then takes an even weirder turn when he's freed by the bride of said wedding, who wants out of Dodge and sees the sudden and violent arrival of a morally ambiguous man in an airplane as her ticket free. Every page is gorgeous, even the ones that don't have gorgeous women on them, but do not doubt, the gorgeous and ethereal beauties who serve as her eternal motif are well represented. There are hints of sci-fi around the corner, or possible psychological horror, something else hiding under Baron's devil-may-care facade, but I sincerely hope the book doesn't go too much further in that direction. The book is at its best when it's just a story about a weird guy who flies a plane and the possibly even weirder woman who hijacks the operation for her own purposes. If you've ever seen It Happen One Night, that's the clear touchstone for the lighter elements of character-driven comedy, which makes the certain promise of a bloody ending to these charming proceedings seem all the more tragic. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marjorie Finnegan Temporal Criminal #4 from AWA in 2021. As promised last time, this issue features that hoariest of tropes, the women's prison. Garth Ennis has spent a lot of time putting his own rather disrespectful spin on established genres, and so too here. If you were worried an issue devoted to women in prison would be overly sexualized and unaccountably violent, well, worry no more, as it is indeed overly sexualized and unaccountably violent. Just not in the way you might be thinking. When Marjorie lands in the Hoosgow, she meets up with an old friend, hyper-intelligent velociraptor by name of Dinah. The very first scene takes place in the showers, where every inmate just happens to be walking around with soap bubbles covering their naughty bits. Marjorie's walking around with a target on her back as well, until Dinah shreds Marge's assailants into tiny little pieces floating at the bottom of the shower. If there is any doubt what the story was about, the title gives it a hint. The Sar-Shank Detention. Only, what if Tim Robbins' character was definitely guilty and Morgan Freeman was a dinosaur? There's a bit more insight into Marjorie's history with Stan Zanzibar and a peek into Harriet Finnegan's home life, including a cameo from her distinctly depressed sex toy. That Ennis actually manages to wring some degree of pathos out of Marjorie's relationship with Dinah, as well as her sister's sudden turn in the direction of sympathy for Marjorie, is definitely to his credit. This remains a pure farce, but nonetheless manages to have real stakes for the characters involved. That's classic Ennis through and through. I'm reminded of Hitman, which could be blisteringly funny one month before turning on a dime the next to be the saddest damn book on the stands. Add to that Goran Sujuka's relentless consistency with drawing attractive women, and we're left with a book as sexy as it is funny, and it's considerably funny. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 9 from 1989 in Marvel Comics. After 2 weeks of flashbacks, we're back to the present of the story. It's World War III, the nukes are gone, but the missiles are about to fly anyway. Just instead of thermonuclear payloads, they've been outfitted with biological agents. Our boy Alfie probably could stop them if he wanted, but he's too busy playing with John Doe and Colonel Novikova, transported to Washington, D.C. in the blink of an eye for the benefit of their omnipotent puppet master. This issue's flashback to 1968 details the immediate aftermath of the fire at the Merivale Orphanage, in which John Doe was adopted by Dr. Yagyu and taken away to California, there to be raised in the way of the ninja. Dr. Yagyu sees the potential in young John, as well as the importance of his connection to the strange boy whose psychic powers were already beginning to influence the world around him. Of course, John seems none the worse for wear for having been trained and conditioned from a young age to become the ultimate ninja. On the contrary, he appears in the present of the series almost preternaturally cheerful and well-balanced for someone who makes their living in the field of death. He's familiar enough with video games, for instance, to recognize the nature of the death trap Alfie springs for him and the Colonel, placing them inside a game and forcing them to battle pixelated Necro ninjas for the purpose of saving the princess, the psychologist Dr. Candy Goodstroke, which again is a real name Larry Hama gave a character. She at least accepts the situation with aplomb, which is better than most people would probably react to becoming a toy of a living god. All this takes place as the war grinds on. Soviet tanks arrive in upstate New York at the moment the missiles leave their silos in Iowa, just as Dr. Yagyu and his crew, still fighting to escape Russia, see the missiles flying on their end. More and more plates are set to spin as the world crumbles in the grip of a madman who only seems to care about torturing his erstwhile best friend. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the first issue of Gilgamesh 2 from 1989 in DC Comics. By the end of the 1980s, Jim Starlin was riding high, coming off a successful run on Batman where he'd written The Death of Robin for Jim Aparo, as well as popular Batman miniseries The Cult with Bernie Wrightson and Cosmic Odyssey from Mike Mignola. This in addition to the still ongoing Dreadstar, for which he'd stepped away from primary creative duties, but still kept a hand in, contributing to every issue that saw print from First Comics. Gilgamesh 2, though almost forgotten now, stands as the culmination of this fertile period at DC, his last major work for the publisher before returning to Marvel, and the run on Silver Surfer that eventually became the epical Infinity Gauntlet saga. Given that background, it's hard not to see this series as a far more personal project than any of the above, save possibly Dreadstar. When it came time to cash his chips with DC after years of commercially successful projects, this was the result: 4 prestige format issues of strange sci-fi satire, a thoroughly cynical picture of the far-off future of 2012, scarred by war and ruled by 12 united corporations under the supposedly benevolent dictatorship of a violent warlord who just happens to also be secretly an alien. Because yes, Gilgamesh 2 is at its heart a kind of Superman riff. The creature known as Gilgamesh is one of the last surviving members of an alien race orphaned by a dying planet who came to Earth in 1987 and were immediately annihilated in orbit by the United States. But not before jettisoning 2 capsules with 2 survivors, infants to be raised by the natives. Of course, due to a mix-up, said survivors just happened to also be two males, ensuring that they would indeed be the last of their race. The first thing to understand about this book is that it's surprisingly funny. Comedy isn't maybe your first association with Starlin, but the book elicited multiple guffaws. Not just the mix-up over two males, but the naming of the first surviving infant by an acid casualty mother who mixes up Beowulf with another story of ancient heroism. The most notable facet of the book, however, is Starlin's art. After years of scripting some of the best artists in the business, he's drawing every page here, and the results are nothing short of stunning. An ugly future defined by immersive detail, down to the litter-strewn asphalt. There can be no doubt this is among the finest work Starlin has ever produced, at least in the realm of art. As for the story itself, well, this is only the first chapter, featuring the first meeting of the two alien brothers and a slugfest that levels an entire wing of the ruler's palace. For better or for worse, what the series promises is, ultimately, Starlin Unchained, a definitive statement on the state of the world by one of the more unique talents in the medium's history. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Spawn 25 from 1994 in Image Comics. Raise your hand if you remember Image X Month. 2.5 years after the company's founding, the partners decided to play a little game. For 1 month, the sixth artist behind the company's launch switched to books. So, if you're following along, in October of 1994, Rob Liefeld drew Shadowhawk, Jim Valentino Youngblood, Eric Larson drew Wildcats, Jim Lee drew Savage Dragon, and finally, Todd McFarlane drew Cyberforce, while Mark Silvestri drew Spawn. In hindsight, the event was a real mixed bag. Of them all, Liefeld and Valentino appeared to have the most fun trading characters. Eric Larson, meanwhile, had no problem knocking out an issue of Wildcats, but had to eventually draw another issue of the Dragon to fit into his original numbering because Jim Lee's issue disrupted his run, which is why there are two versions of Savage Dragon 13. And that brings us to Spawn 25, which features Silvestri drawing Spawn, but only drawing. It struck me at the time and now as frankly a bit of a cheat to simply have Silvestri drawing a normal issue of the book from Todd's script, but to be fair, Todd does the same for Cyberforce, so we don't really get to see what Silvestri would do with the character if given a blank slate. We get to see him as functionally a fill-in artist. But by issue 25, Todd was already starting to move away from full-time art duties on the book anyway. Greg Capullo was already in the wings, having drawn a number of issues of the book, and would, from then on, be Todd's artistic partner for many years. Silvestri, meanwhile, is a pro. By 94, he has already changed his style up from the lean action storytelling of his Wolverine run, and fully embraced the Image Baroque. Lots of little lines for the inker, crowded layouts with room for more captions than you'd expect, fancy colors to carry a lot of the weight. Frankly, as someone who reads a lot of Silvestri, he does a great McFarlane here. Having already changed his style up considerably to fit into the company, he draws an issue of Spawn that appears very much like the issues that surround it. Incidentally, this issue also features the first appearance of Tremor, who isn't actually named, but who already had a toy in production, which should give you an idea of where Todd's head was already at in 1994. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, number 139 from 1971 in DC Comics. Although this is far from my first Jack Kirby, this is without a doubt one of my very favorite Kirby comics. Immediately upon learning about the Don Rickles two-parter in the early 90s, I was inspired to run down this issue on the follow-up, 141. This was published early in the King's 70s tenure at DC. This hit stands alongside Mr. Miracle number 3 to give you the idea. The bloom was still on the rose, and Kirby's fiendishly fecund imagination was still firing on all cylinders for the distinguished competition. What I truly, sincerely love about this comic is the way it offers insight into its creator's occasionally strange mindset. His fourth world of interconnected titles was only a few months old. Darkseid himself had premiered barely half a year previous in the pages of this same magazine, but Kirby's restless imagination was never content to sit still. In this case, his restless imagination led Kirby in the direction of a two-issue crossover between Superman and Don Rickles. Yes, that Don Rickles, famed insult comedian and someone who would probably under normal circumstances not be drafted into war against the forces of Apocalypse. But here we have not one but two Rickles. Yes, not only is the real Don Rickles teased for the second half of the story, but this issue is devoted to introducing Don's not-so-evil twin, a hapless and repellent office boy named Goody Rickles. Notice the slightly different spelling. Where does Goody come from? The possible inference is that the same secret DNA project that cloned the original Newsboy Legion and Guardian may very well have also created a second Don Rickles. If that possibility abilities proscribed, we're left with the plain fact that there is an unaccountable and annoying doppelganger of Don Rickles loose in the Bronze Age metropolis and working for Morgan Edge, and in that capacity almost as big a thorn in Edge's side as Kenton Olsen. Anyway, while fighting in her gang, Goody accidentally takes Superman off the board entirely by ensuring Clark Kent falls into a trap and is teleported to another dimension. Then he, Jimmy, and the Guardian are force-fed tiny bombs and threaten to explode in 24 hours. A laid-back day for Olsen, in other words. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at The Incredible Hulk number 181 from 1975 in Marvel Comics, or more precisely, the recent facsimile edition with the foil cover, because I'm fancy like that. After one panel at the end of last issue, Wolverine leaps off the cover of this milestone, wading recklessly into a war between two of the most powerful monsters on the planet. Three men are credited with Wolverine's creation. This issue's writer, Len Wein, editor Roy Thomas, and Marvel's art director, John Romita Sr., who drew the first sketch of the old Knucklehead's distinctive yellow and blue. This issue's artist, Herb Trimpe, has sometimes been credited as a co-creator, but he himself denied the role. Of course, the Wolverine we all know and love took many more years and creators to develop. A crowd of worthies, including the likes of Gil Kane, Dave Cockrum, John Byrne, and Chris Claremont, to name the most prominent. Sometimes it takes a village, and never has that been more true than for Wolverine. However, with that said, it's remarkable just how much is solid from the start. He's a short king with an animalistic temper who gets by fighting much larger opponents by being smaller and faster and meaner, and sometimes lets his feral nature get the best of him. Strange to think, in the context of his first appearance, he's just another jobber being trotted out for the benefit of getting his bell rung by old Jade Jaws, and indeed, his role in this book seems to be that of a spoiler, getting in the way of Hulk's rematch with Wendigo. Eventually, the fight gives way to tragedy as a new victim takes up the curse of the Wendigo, leaving Wolverine on the ground after one final staggering blow from the Hulk. There's no shame in getting your bell rung by the Hulk, of course, a fairly common occurrence for any Marvel character, and it wouldn't be the last time for Wolverine either. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Poison Ivy Uncovered from 2023 in DC Comics. If you buy new comics today, you're probably familiar with the constant dilemma of which cover to buy. Sometimes it's not that hard. When in doubt, just pick the standard edition with the logo. Can't go wrong there. Sometimes the A cover is the most attractive. But there are other times when picking and choosing between multiple options is an agonizing ordeal. For instance, say you're me and one of your favorite books is Poison Ivy. Just about every issue of G. Willow Wilson's seminal run on the character offers a terrible, horrible, no good choice between excellent options. But thankfully, we live in a world where DC occasionally offers these nice pin-up collections of some of the very best variants. If you've been reading along with Poison Ivy, you know the book has switched up the main character's status quo, continuing the trend of pushing her ever so gently from the anti-villain column and into that of the anti-hero. A subtle and pedantic distinction, perhaps, but a necessary one in a world where it's difficult to paint her motivations as truly sinister, and a romantic relationship with Harley Quinn is literally a franchise in itself. But with that said, she remains the preeminent femme fatale of the DC universe, a role long since abdicated by Catwoman for many decades, since that character became the sympathetic protagonist of her own franchise in the 90s. So, if you want a book filled with pictures of Poison Ivy being dangerous and sexy, this one's for you, featuring work from the first year of the recent run of the book by some of the best artists currently working. Jenny Frisson, represented by two pieces, Tulu Lotay, Stanley Art Germalau, David Nakayama, Dan Mora, also represented twice, as is Joshua Middleton, Amy Reeder, Terry and Rachel Dodson, Sozo Micah. Frankly, there aren't really any weak spots. My problem here is, sadly, the same problem I've had with other recent uncovered books, which would be, this isn't anything resembling a complete catalog of these covers, and they're not presented in anything but thematic order. As a Poison Ivy fan, I'd pay more for a thicker compendium that was also complete, to say nothing of also including Jessica Fong's fantastic main covers for the book, in many cases more striking than any of the variants, and which also deserve to be appreciated without trade dress. However, for the price point, this is still a very nice collection of pictures, please do not doubt, featuring some of the most striking covers of the last year. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marjorie Finnegan Temporal Criminal number 5 from AWA in 2021. The scabrous saga continues with an issue devoted to the origins of the self-styled Lord of Evil and his sidekick, the hapless erstwhile Mr. Marjorie Finnegan Stan Zanzibar. If you were thinking Garth Ennis was going soft, this issue puts paid to any notion that our great Irish provocateur was settling down. The Lord of Evil story begins with botched infanticide, a scene so brutal the characters themselves practically break the fourth wall to assure assure the reader the book hasn't become a pro-life tract. You see, the Lord of Evil's great misfortune is to have been cognizant from the moment of conception, leaving them angry and vengeful before even being born. From there, it's a cavalcade of escalating atrocities as the orphan Lord of Evil grapples with having the brain of a full-grown adult, the superbrain of a genius no less, and being stuck in a regular child's body. The attempt to age themselves prematurely results in the accidental creation of a time machine, which allows the Lord of Evil to take in the entire panoply of human history. And so the pint-sized misanthrope comes to the inescapable conclusion that humanity is fundamentally no good and would benefit from his tweaking history to become the master of all time and space. That appears a bridge too far for Zanzibar, whose villainous origin involves him being a sad little baby about the fact that Marjorie enjoyed a great deal of recreational sex prior to their marriage. Zanzibar is more pitiful than anything else, a self-styled devil who doesn't really seem to have a lot of motivation other than instant gratification. Meanwhile, the escaped Finnegan sisters have their long-awaited rapprochement prior to settling off down the time stream for the purpose of sabotaging the Lord of Evil's best-laid plans for historical domination. A reasonable reader might occasionally wonder at Ennis's excesses, but the occasional and squeamish moments of raw transgression have been a staple of his work all the way back to Hellblazer. As with similarly rough sequences from Preacher and The Boys, your mileage may vary as to whether or not it holds together in the final accounting. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 10 from 1989 in Marvel Comics. We pick up this week with the continuation of last issue's cliffhanger. The missiles have been launched from both sides, only filled with biological agents to substitute for the nuclear material disappeared by Alfie, the inciting action that spurred the start of World War III. The name of this story is 22 minutes, the time from the moment the missiles are launched to their first landfall at their respective targets. Of course, Alfie isn't happy to learn that the war has accelerated so precipitously. This issue offers us a bit of insight into Alfie's character as more than simply a maladjusted and mentally ill danger. The fact is, he has been genuinely disappointed, in his almost childlike way, that getting rid of nuclear weapons didn't spur any kind of peace, and in fact had precisely the opposite effect. He's not trying to destroy the human race. In his twisted brain, he genuinely believes he's trying to save it, which is why, as soon as he's informed of the missiles having launched, he sets about fixing the problem in the only way he knows how, splitting his consciousness into 12,586 parts and tracking down each and every missile flying through the stratosphere. He can't outright stop them all with his power so distributed, but he can try and render the biological payloads inert by messing with the RNA of the engineered viruses. Of course, things don't quite go according to plan when a rogue general uses the specter of imminent destruction to try and even the score with Alfie by offering an unkind revelation regarding his beloved foster parents. Meanwhile, with Alfie so distracted, John and Colonel Novikova are free to escape the video game world in which they've been caught, a process which then entails them being captured by the U.S. military the moment they reach the outside. It would perhaps be incorrect to assert that the sexual tension between John Doe and the Colonel is overpowering, but his commitment to get under her skin certainly seems like the kind of thing the CIA agent would do if they wanted to flirt with a KGB officer. Through it all, the series maintains Hammer's commitment to the premise that the people who give orders in the military have no idea what they're doing. As he says in the letters page of this issue, I don't expect logical decisions from officers. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the second issue of Gilgamesh 2 from 1989 in DC Comics. Jim Starlin's satirical epic of the near future continues as the mythic resonance compounds. In the ancient epic of Gilgamesh, the great king of that name fought and then befriended the wild man Enkidu before then battling great demons together. Specifically for our purposes, they traveled to a great forest to fight the monstrous Umbaba, guardian of the trees. So, this issue of Gilgamesh 2 opens with modern Gilgamesh's secret brother Otto, former jungle wild man, civilized much like Enkidu by the influence of women, and now an officer of the same corporation Gilgamesh controls, presiding over a vast construction project in Central America. Supposedly intended as a more eco-friendly development, Otto explains the necessity of building in harmony with, as opposed to opposition to, the forces of nature. These themes are distressingly contemporary, with Otto explaining in detail the necessity of maintaining the forest for the purpose of preserving the planet's oxygen cycle, not necessarily a priority for corporate developers here or in the story. There's also a brief aside about media corporations forbidding any mention of birth control control, so as not to upset their religious customers. Anyone familiar with Starlin's work for Warlock or Dreadstar knows there's no love lost between the man and organized religion, and this story offers a very concise portrait of the means by which a capitalist system can be thoroughly captured by the moral concerns of its most aggrieved customer base. The overriding conservatism of the near-future corporatocracy also appears to coexist easily with the coarsening of sexual mores and the widespread acceptance of exploitation, again pointing to Starlin's larger thematic concerns regarding the degree to which this kind of system incentivizes any kind of abuse that can occur under the auspices of profitable enterprise. Money dissolves the illusion of hypocrisy when the most important value of all is simply control. Now, what does this have to do with our boy Gilgamesh? Well, there's a monster in Central America, some kind of powerful beast who specializes in murdering every single person who comes near it, preventing anyone from developing too deep into the jungle. In order to stave off a challenge to his position from the board of directors, Gilgamesh agrees to lead an expedition with Otto for the purposes of killing the monster ensconced firmly in the dense jungle around a complex of ancient Mesoamerican temples, reassembled, we are told, to construct a kind of historical Disneyland. No aspect of human culture or natural splendor survives commodification, and so we see Gilgamesh's war party picked off one by one, until the only two survivors are Gilgamesh and Otto, the former of whom finally reveals to his brother the nature of their connection, just prior to the climactic battle in which they defeat the Nightshade monster, but only after it has killed 80 other men. If this were the myth, of course, Gilgamesh would be rewarded by the goddess Inanna for his deeds, with an invitation to be her consort. But as it is, he just gets to return to Texas in order to fight the techno-ninjas the board is marshaling for the purpose of murdering him. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Dagar the Invincible number 11 from Gold Key Comics in 1975. If you need any proof that Conan the Barbarian was an epical success for the House of Ideas, proof can be found in the fact that so many companies spent so much of the subsequent decade following the release of Conan number 1 in 1970 trying to replicate the success. DC spent a long time trying to find traction in the sword and sorcery market before finally hitting pay dirt in the late 70s with the success of Warlord, which proved their most enduring contribution to the trend. But Conan sold well enough that even Gold Key had a go in the form of Dagar the Invincible. Premiering 2 years after Conan in 1972, Dagar was the creation of writer Donald Glut and artist Jesse Santos. Glut worked extensively across the industry throughout the 1970s, before matriculating to Hollywood, where he contributed to just about every popular kids cartoon made between the mid-70s through the mid-90s. He also wrote the novelization of Empire Strikes Back, after having turned down the opportunity to write the novelization of the original film that eventually passed to Alan Dean Foster. The real attraction for Dagar, however, is the art of Jesse Santos, a member of the vaunted Filipino invasion who redefined fantasy art across the industry in the 1970s. Santos enjoyed an extensive career in his native country before coming to America. After the initial success of Dagar, Santos actually turned down the offer to draw Conan for Marvel in the mid-70s, preferring instead to follow Glut into the fields of animation and advertising, where he presumably made much more money. Based on the evidence, it's hard not to see why Marvel wanted Santos on their payroll. This is frankly fantastic work on an unfairly forgotten book. Heavily influenced by popular commercial art from the period, it represented a clean descent from the likes of Hal Foster and Bern Hogarth, emphasizing forward-looking design and sophisticated gestural line work over what was already then codified as Marvel's John Buscema-influenced house style. Nothing against Big John, but Santos here was on another tip entirely. The story may have been rather standard fare as fantasy comics go, but it looks so good, so unmistakably distinctive, you can't help but wonder just what he could have done with the immortal Cimmerian. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, number 141 from 1971 in DC Comics. Superman's team-up with the incomparable Don Rickles screams to an end in the most absurd comics event of 1971. Now, it's worth mentioning that a famous comedian guest starring in a comic mag wasn't really that out of place at the time. Jerry Lewis headlined his own DC mag for 14 years, from 1957 to 1971, while Bob Hope's DC book lasted an impressive 18 years, 1950 to 68, and lest you believe that manner of stunt casting is a thing of the more distant past, remember that the cast of Saturday Night Live appeared alongside Spider-Man in Marvel Team-Up in 1978. The Avengers were guests on Late Night with David Letterman in 1983, and Jimmy Kimmel appeared in the pages of Spider-Man literally just last year. There's a grand tradition here, so Kirby's decision to devote 2 issues of real estate in the prime time of the Fourth World Saga makes just a little bit more sense, if only just a bit. Also worth pointing out, this was from the period when DC was padding out their page count with reprints. So the second half of the book offers the origin of the Guardian and the Newsboy Legion from all the way in 1942. And lest ye be confused, issue 140 was a reprint special that had nothing to do with Kirby's run, a normal enough occurrence at the time. Now, despite the humorous patina, this is also an important issue, presenting as it does the very first time Superman has ever seen Apocalypse, marooned as Clark Kent in a space capsule, hurtling through the dimensional barrier thanks to the clumsiness of Goody Rickles. That's why it's Clark Kent, not Superman, who first meets Light Ray here. Remember, up until this point, the only citizens of New Genesis Superman has actually met were the Forever People in the first issue of that series. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Jimmy Olsen, the ostensible star of the mag, is still facing certain death, having been force-fed pyrogranulites alongside Goody and the Guardian. Most of this issue is spent with Jimmy and Goody about to explode, at which point they burst into Morgan Edge's office, informing him that they're being murdered by Intergang. And maybe a trip to the hospital might have been the better strategy here, but I'm sure Jimmy knows what he's doing. It just so happens, of course, that the real Don Rickles is also in Edge's office, bringing the comedian face-to-face at last with his demented twin. Although it might seem at first glance out of the King's wheelhouse, he clearly has a lot of fun unleashing Rickles here. The cover advertises the greatest climax ever seen in comics. And would you believe, all of this, 2 issues of setup, has been lovingly constructed by the King to set up a fart joke with a boom tube? You better believe it, Hockey Puck. When Kirby says, "Don't ask, just buy it," you know he means business. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the Avengers 100th Anniversary Special from 2014 in Marvel. What we're looking at today is one of the more strange artifacts from the company's last decade, part of the 100th Anniversary mini-event, which saw the release of a series of one-shots devoted to shining a light on possible futures for the company's most storied books. The core gimmick of the anniversary is that this comic hails from the year 2061, from the 100th anniversary of the Marvel Age of Comics, symbolized by release of the first issue of Lee and Kirby's Fantastic Four. So, this issue kicks off en media res with the Avengers scattered, and a skeleton crew of Doctor Strange, Beta Ray Bill, and Rogue left to recover in the aftermath of a devastating Badoon invasion. The real appeal here is the talent responsible, none other than James Stokoe, unleashed for a full-length comic about the future of the Marvel Universe. Stokoe is perhaps most famous for his work on Orc-Stain at Image and Godzilla, the Half-Century War. If you've never had the pleasure, his comics are uniformly stunning, defined by an unmistakable devotion to meticulous detail. He colors his own work as well, a crucially important step when you consider how easy it can be for highly detailed work to become bogged down in muddy palettes. Despite the profuse detail on every page, the color scheme remains a clear, light blue and dark red, a bright spectrum that allows for the deployment of eye-popping pastels throughout. There isn't a page that isn't striking from stem to stern. The story, such as it is, features our trio of Avengers falling back to their headquarters in Kuala Lumpur, where Tony Stark survives as a brain in a vat, fielding an army of iron drones. Of course, the aftermath of invasion presents the perfect opportunity for the Mole Man to lead an attack on the surface world, that is, Mole Man III. The story ends with the restoration of the Mole Man's realm, in contrast with the brief teaser we're given of Captain America's fruitless quest to find the lost continent of North America banished to the negative zone. A unique event made memorable by an indelible creator. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Uncle Scrooge Adventures 33 from 1994 in Gladstone Comics. The comic before us today holds a very special distinction for being the last ever comic book story ever written by the great Carl Barks. Yes, that Carl Barks, my pick for the greatest cartoonist of the previous century, an unparalleled talent whose influence is still felt across the medium and across the world. The man retired from drawing new stories in 1966, and although he scripted a number of books in the years to follow, his main artistic output in the final decades of his life were the paintings that he produced for private collectors beginning in 1971, when Disney granted him a royalty-free license to produce art based on the ducks who had defined the bulk of his professional output. The only new stories he produced after his final gig scripting stories for the Junior Woodchucks comics and ended in the mid-70s was a story told as a series of paintings, Go Slowly, Sands of Time, published in the Life and Times of Uncle Scrooge McDuck collection in 1981. That's where I encountered it for the first time, receiving the book for Christmas in 1988 after seeing the ads for months in the back of Gladstone Blackstone Comics. But little did anyone know, least of all Barks himself, there was one more story left to be told. After the death of his wife, Margaret, in 1993, he embarked on an uncharacteristic world tour across country into Europe, and it was during this burst of activity, visiting his paintings and the galleries that hung them, that he found himself agreeing to script a new Duck story, his first comics work in 2 decades. Although he later regretted having made the commitment, describing himself perhaps semi-jokingly as having been trapped, according to the text piece herein, he nevertheless delivered a script on that most classic of Barksian themes, a treasure hunt through the world history, with Scrooge, Donald, and the boys sailing the wine-dark Aegean Sea in search of the ancient treasure of the Trojan War. To execute this script, they drafted William Van Horn, by 1994 already a Duck veteran, having begun his career as a cartoonist during the black and white explosion of the 1980s, beginning with Nervous Rex for Blackthorn in 1985, as well as some pieces for Fantagraphics' groundbreaking furry anthology Critters in the later part of that decade, before finally hooking up with Gladstone and the Ducks in 1988. If it doesn't perhaps rate in the first rank of Barks' output, it still has more spring in its step than you might expect. The mechanics of treasure hunting and the scraps of historical lore, as filtered through the ever-omniscient Junior Woodchuck's guidebook, feel very much like true totems of the man himself, with the recurring gag of Scrooge whinnying like a horse to open his automatic doors, just the kind of absurd grace note that you don't always find in second-rate Duck stories, often less willing to humiliate their primaries than Barks, who was never afraid to drag his characters through the mud when circumstances dictated. The back of the book's filled out with a reprint of Barks' first Uncle Scrooge story, or rather, his first Uncle Scrooge solo story, with Scrooge having first appeared in the Donald Duck story Christmas on Bear Mountain in 1947, before premiering in his own series in 1952 with Only a Poor Old Man. After years of subsequent development as a supporting character for Donald, Scrooge's own series begins with the character more or less fully formed, a skinflint in the grand Scottish tradition, willing to go to absurd and often self-defeating lengths to keep his cash from falling into the hands of the Beagle Boys, a clan of professional thieves who would go on to become Scrooge's greatest foe, at least in terms of sheer number of appearances. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Marjorie Finnegan Temporal Criminal number 6 from AWA in 2021. Our story rolls towards its rousing climax with a change of pace issue that sees the famous Finnegan sisters cast ashore at 6 billion years AD, brainstorming for ways to defeat the Lord of Evil in his plot to conquer human history. In practice, we see the Lord of Evil is fixated on exploding a particular aspect of the human condition, our propensity to accept religious hypocrisy at face value, one of Garth Ennis's overriding thematic concerns. The problem is, it's a lot easier for the bad guys to exploit this historical quirk for their purposes than for the good guys. The most evil man in human history can't abide the hypocrisy of religion constructed on a scaffolding of fairy tales and just-so stories. Not that different from Preacher, then, and just as in that book, the actual truth, such as it is only important as a mechanism for control. Now, the problem for Marjorie is that she doesn't have a clue how to combat the Lord of Evil's fiendish plot. This issue sees her traveling to the far future to speak to the last human being, who just happens to also be a repulsive example of corpulent chauvinism. Now, the distaste for fat characters is sadly another hallmark of Ennis's work, a rather odd blind spot for someone whose work has always enjoyed a robust streak of humanism, but one supposes nobody's perfect. Meanwhile, the hapless Stan Zanzibar wises up and tries to flee the Lord of Evil, having gotten the full picture that he's nowhere near as sinister as he needs to be to swim in those waters. He's a fundamentally weak man enthralled to a strong personality, and that never ends well. Certainly he will be useful for the Finnegan sisters when they figure out the next step for their plan. I'd wager that in lieu of any complex plot, they'll opt for the frontal assault, but I guess we'll have to check back next week to see how it all plays out. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 11 from 1990 in Marvel Comics. It's the end of the world as they know it, but things are feeling strangely fine for the gang. Alfie may not have stopped every missile, but he appears to have been able to stop just enough to prevent total apocalypse. The few places they were able to explode do appear to suffer the effects of the plague strains, further mutated by Alfie to unknown ends. Speaking of Alfie, he's at the end of his rope, overwhelmed by the effort of fighting off the entire world and unsure as to his next move. Leave it to the good Dr. Dr. Goodstroke, who thinks fast and inspires Alfie to live up to the example of Galactus by leaving the Earth forever in search of the life in the rest of the universe. Of course, she probably wasn't planning on him needing a herald or her being transformed by Alfie into a distaff version of the Silver Surfer, but that's enough for Alfie. With the Lincoln Monument as his de facto spaceship, he lifts off and away from Earth, accompanied only by his new herald. Will this mark the end of Alfie's threat? Almost certainly not, but it gets him off the board for the moment. As for the ostensible star of the book, after an ambush by Russian infiltrators in U.S. military uniform, John Doe finds himself chasing Colonel Novikova down the streets of Washington, D.C. Of course she has a key to a safe house in Georgetown, and of course that safe house is manned by a bevy of beautiful babes wielding Kalashnikovs aimed squarely at John Doe the moment he opens the door. It must not be overlooked that Nth Man is a resolutely horny series, in touch with its raging libido in a way that G.I. Joe never really could be, given its putative audience. Sure, Baroness and Zorana certainly did their share for the prepubescent boys of America, and surely a few girls as well, but genuine sexual tension simmers throughout this series between John and the Colonel, still somehow wearing that same strategically torn evening gown for a solid year of stories. And of course there's Dr. Candy Goodstroke, stripped to her underwear and painted silver, just like graduate school all over again.